I remember the smell first, not smoke, but hot metal mixed with something sweet and chemical, the kind that turns lethal in a second. I remember the flash, as if someone pressed the sun directly against my face. And then silence. The kind of silence where your brain desperately tries to decide whether you're still alive or already gone. I worked as a lab technician in a private research facility outside Pittsburgh. Nothing heroic. Test tubes, labels, logs, protocols. A routine so repetitive it felt safe. I liked that about it. Predictability was my way of proving to myself that life could be built step by step, without drama, without surprises, without anyone else's games. That evening, I stayed late. Deadlines were tight, management was tense, and I wanted to finish one last measurement cycle so the next morning wouldn't start in chaos. I remember adjusting my safety goggles, writing a label, thinking, 5 more minutes and I'm done. That's when everything went wrong. Not in a cinematic way, no slow motion, no heroic leap. It was fast and ugly. Glass shattered, heat swallowed the air. My face took the impact before my body understood what was happening. Pain didn't arrive immediately. Shock always wins that race. When I woke up, I couldn't see. At first, I thought it was darkness. Then I realized it was bandages. Voices floated in and out. Someone said my name. Someone else said, third-degree burns. Another voice, careful and professional, explained that the explosion had been caused by a failed reaction I wasn't even directly handling. I tried to speak. My throat burned. Panic rose, sharp and animal. They sedated me. The next clear memory is my husband's voice. Ethan. No, not Ethan. His name was Mark. He stood by my bed in the ICU in downtown Pittsburgh, holding my hand like it might disappear if he let go. He told me everything would be fine, that doctors were amazing these days, that science worked miracles. I wanted to ask one question. What do I look like? But I didn't ask. I was afraid of the answer. The surgeon came later, calm, direct, honest in the way doctors are when they've learned that false hope is cruelty. He explained that my face had suffered extensive damage, not just skin, deeper structures, tendons, tissue. He said I would survive, that I would recover physically. Then he said plastic reconstruction would be unavoidable, expensive, complex, experimental if we wanted real results. I heard Mark say he'd find the money, sell the apartment, take loans, do whatever it took. I closed my eyes and cried without tears, because somewhere beneath the morphine and fear, one thought cut through everything else. Even if they give me a new face, will it still be me? I wasn't allowed to see myself for weeks. The doctors said it was for medical reasons, swelling, graft stability, healing timelines. But I knew the truth was simpler. They were protecting me from something I wasn't ready to process. Or maybe they were protecting themselves from watching me break. Mark came every day. He sat by my bed in that sterile Pittsburgh hospital room, telling me about ordinary things on purpose. Traffic, a coworker's bad joke, a new cafe that had opened near our apartment. He spoke like the world was still intact, like nothing fundamental had shifted. Sometimes I listened. Sometimes I drifted. Sometimes I counted the beeps of machines just to stay grounded. When I asked about my face, finally, quietly, he froze for half a second too long. Then he told me I was still beautiful, that I was alive. That was what mattered. That answer scared me more than the truth ever could have. A few days later, the head surgeon asked to speak with Mark privately. I watched them through the glass wall as they talked. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Mark's shoulders tense, then sag. When he came back, his smile was strained, like something stitched too tightly. That evening, another doctor visited me, younger. Different energy, not rushed, not rehearsed. He explained that a plastic surgeon in Boston had taken interest in my case. Dr. Adrian Hale, a rising name in reconstructive surgery, working with experimental techniques involving regenerative scaffolds and stem cell integration. He'd been searching for a patient like me, severe trauma, otherwise healthy, strong recovery indicators. The catch was obvious even before it was said. It was experimental. Not unsafe, but new. Not guaranteed, but promising. And incredibly expensive. Unless I agreed to be part of a clinical trial. In that case, the surgeries would be covered. I asked the question Mark couldn't. What happens if it doesn't work? The doctor didn't lie. He said then I would still have a face, just not the one I remembered, and maybe not the one I hoped for. That night, after Mark left, I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember myself, not my face. My life, the lab, the routines, the quiet confidence of knowing who I was when I walked into a room. I realized how much of my identity had been built on being unremarkable in a way that felt safe, invisible enough to be left alone, recognizable enough to belong. By morning, I had decided. If I was going to lose my face anyway, I would not cling to the past out of fear. I told them to contact Dr. Hale. 2 weeks later, I was transferred to a private clinic outside Boston. Mark came with me, but something between us had already shifted. Not broken, just displaced, like a bone healing slightly out of alignment. Dr. Hale met me on the first day. I still couldn't see myself, but I didn't need a mirror to know when someone was looking at me like a person instead of a patient. He spoke to me, not around me, asked questions about my life before the accident, about what I missed most, about what scared me. When he left the room, I realized something unsettling. For the first time since the explosion, I felt seen. And I didn't yet understand how dangerous that feeling could become. The first surgery lasted 11 hours. I knew that because they told me afterward, like it was an achievement I should be proud of. I wasn't. I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with my body. Each time I woke up, I had to remember again what had happened, and each time the truth landed differently, like a bruise you keep pressing to see if it still hurts. Dr. Hale checked on me personally. Every morning, every evening. He explained what they had done in precise, careful language, graphs, microvascular connections, regenerative matrices. But he never pretended it was magic. He said healing was a partnership between medicine and patients, between science and will. Mark came less often now. At first, I told myself it was practical, the distance between Boston and Pittsburgh, his job, the cost of travel, all reasonable explanations. But when he did come, he stayed shorter. His hugs were careful, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile, or like he didn't know where to place his hands anymore. I tried not to take it personally. I had enough to deal with already. Recovery was slow, painful, intimate in a way that stripped me of dignity. Nurses saw everything. Doctors touched my face daily, adjusted dressings, examined tissue as if it belonged to an atlas instead of a person. Dr. Hale was different. He always warned me before he touched me, explained what he was about to do, asked if I was ready. Small things, but they mattered. They reminded me that my body was still mine, even now. One afternoon, while adjusting the bandages, he told me about his time in Japan, about surgeons who used to give patients paper cranes for luck after Hiroshima, believing the act of care itself could change outcomes. He said he didn't believe in superstition, but he believed in symbols. The next day, there was a small paper crane on my bedside table. I didn't ask where it came from. I didn't need to. 10 days after the surgery, they removed the first layer of bandages. Not all of them, just enough. I asked for a mirror. Dr. Hale hesitated, just briefly, then nodded. He held it for me, steady, angled carefully. I looked. What I saw wasn't horror. It wasn't beauty either. It was a stranger, swollen, red, uneven, a face in transition, like clay not yet fired. My features were there, but rearranged, softened, uncertain. I stared longer than anyone expected me to. Finally, I laughed. A sharp, disbelieving sound that surprised even me. "I don't recognize her," I said. Dr. Hale replied quietly, "That doesn't mean she isn't you." That night, I cried for the first time since the accident, not because of how I looked, but because I realized something terrifying and liberating at the same time. The woman I used to be was gone, and whoever I was becoming would have to be built from scratch. The clinic became my whole world. Days blurred into a routine of procedures, assessments, physical therapy, and waiting. Healing was measured in millimeters and percentages. Progress charts replaced calendars. I learned to read doctors' faces the way gamblers read cards, searching for reassurance in the smallest shifts. Dr. Hale never lied to me. When things went well, he said so. When they didn't, he explained why. That honesty created a strange kind of trust. Not intimacy, not yet, but reliance. He was the person who knew my face better than anyone alive, including me. Mark called in the evenings, sometimes. Our conversations shrank to updates and logistics. He told me about bills, about paperwork, about how tired he was. I listened and felt guilty for being the reason his life had become heavier, smaller. Once, he said, "I miss you." I almost asked which version. Instead, I said it back. The clinic psychologist warned me about identity drift, about how patients with facial trauma often experience a sense of detachment from their old lives. She said relationships sometimes don't survive it. I nodded like I hadn't already noticed. One afternoon, while I was practicing facial muscle movements in front of a mirror, smiling, frowning, relearning expressions like a language I'd forgotten, Dr. Hale stopped behind me. He didn't speak at first. Then he said, "You're harder on yourself than you need to be." I told him I didn't recognize my own smile. He answered, "Most people don't, even without an accident." That night, he invited me to sit in the clinic's small courtyard. Officially, it was part of rehabilitation. Sunlight, fresh air, sensory grounding. Unofficially, it felt like a conversation I hadn't had in a long time. He told me about his first failed surgery, about the patient who never forgave him, about how success in his field wasn't measured in perfection, but in survival and dignity. I realized he was telling me this because he trusted me. That scared me more than the surgeries. 2 weeks later, Mark visited unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway of my room, stiff, unsure. When he saw my uncovered face for the first time, he smiled too fast. It's really good," he said. I waited. He didn't touch me. He asked about the doctor instead, about how long I'd be staying, about whether the trial required follow-ups. That night, after he left, I didn't cry. I just understood. Love, I was learning, doesn't always leave in a dramatic way. Sometimes it fades quietly, out of politeness, until one day you realize you're already alone. And for the first time since the explosion, I wondered whether that loneliness might be the beginning of something else. When they finally removed the last of the protective dressings, everyone expected a reaction. Relief, gratitude, tears. I gave them none of that. I sat still and looked at the woman in the mirror like she was someone I'd just met in an elevator. Familiar enough to recognize, distant enough not to trust. My features were harmonious. That was the word, doctor. Hale used, balanced. The scars were there, but faint, almost deliberate, as if they belonged to a different story than the one I remembered living through. "This isn't about beauty," he said carefully. "It's about function. You'll be able to live normally." Normally? Mark came the next day. This time he brought flowers. Too many. Bright, cheerful, apologetic. He stared longer than before. Too long. Then he smiled again. The same rehearsed smile. "You look incredible," he said. Like nothing ever happened." That was when I knew something had broken between us. He wanted the accident erased. I needed it acknowledged. Over the following days, he became more present and more distant at the same time. He touched my arm, but not my face. He spoke about the future in practical terms, schedules, moving back, getting back to normal. Normal had become his obsession. One evening, while he talked about redecorating the apartment, I realized he was planning a life that didn't include the version of me who had survived, only the version that looked acceptable. Dr. Hale noticed the change before I admitted it to myself. "You don't have to go back just because you feel grateful," he said quietly after a follow-up. "I'm not," I answered too quickly. He didn't push. Instead, he offered me something unexpected. A position. Not a job exactly. A research assistant role during my recovery. Patient liaison. someone who understood trauma from the inside. "You don't have to accept," he added, "but you have a way of listening that people trust." Mark hated the idea. He said it wasn't real work, that I should rest, that the clinic was too much for me. What he meant was, it was changing me, and he was right. I accepted. The first day I helped another patient, a woman who refused to look in the mirror, I realized something quietly, without drama. My life hadn't been paused by the explosion. It had been redirected. And somewhere between sterile hallways and soft-spoken gratitude, I began to understand that survival wasn't the opposite of loss. Sometimes it was the beginning of truth. By the time my discharge date approached, I had learned how to live inside two versions of myself at once. The woman I used to be still existed in memory. The one who rushed through mornings, who complained about small things, who believed stability meant safety. And then there was the woman I was becoming, shaped by scars no one could quite see unless they knew where to look. Mark began staying overnight again. At first, I told myself it was progress, that couples survived worse. That time would smooth the sharp edges between us. But something felt off. He started correcting me in public, finishing my sentences, steering conversations away from the accident, from the clinic, from anything that reminded others, or himself, that I had been broken and remade. Once, when a nurse asked how I was coping emotionally, Mark answered for me. "She's strong," he said, squeezing my hand. "Always has been." The nurse looked at me instead of him. I didn't contradict him. I just smiled. Dr. Hale noticed the tension in subtler ways, the way my shoulders stiffened when Mark entered the room, the way I relaxed when he left. One evening, after a long shift helping with intake interviews, Dr. Hale asked if I wanted to walk with him to the parking lot. It was late. The city lights hummed around the clinic, steady and indifferent. "You're allowed to change," he said casually, as if we were discussing the weather. "You don't owe anyone the version of you they're most comfortable with." I didn't answer, because part of me still believed I did. The turning point came quietly. Mark suggested we celebrate my recovery with a dinner downtown. He chose the restaurant. He chose my outfit. He even suggested a hairstyle, something softer. When I hesitated, he laughed and said I was overthinking again. At the restaurant, I caught my reflection in the glass wall. I looked polished, presentable, almost perfect, and completely absent. Mark talked about our future like it was already decided, moving back, me quitting the clinic role, putting everything behind us. That phrase again, behind us. I excused myself to the restroom and stood there for a long time, staring at my face. It wasn't mine yet, but it wasn't his either. When I returned to the table, I told him I needed space. Not a break, not a pause. Space. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just looked tired. "So this is it?" he asked. "After everything I stayed through?" That sentence did something irreversible. I realized then that he saw my survival as a debt, and I knew, with a clarity that surprised me, that if I stayed, I would disappear again. Slowly this time, politely, without explosions. That night, I didn't go home with him. I went back to the clinic apartment they'd offered me temporarily. I lay awake until morning, afraid, relieved, grieving a marriage that had ended long before either of us had the courage to admit it. And somewhere in that quiet, I understood that my story wasn't about losing a face. It was about finally choosing one. The city felt different once I was living on my own again. Not kinder, not easier, just honest. I moved into a small furnished apartment near the clinic. Temporary, neutral, mine. The first night there, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and realized I didn't know who I was supposed to call. That used to scare me. This time, it didn't. Mark didn't fight my decision. He sent a message instead. Long, careful, full of words like sacrifice, loyalty, history. He reminded me of everything we'd been through. He ended with, "I hope you remember who stood by you when no one else could." I read it twice. Then I deleted it. At the clinic, my role became more defined. I wasn't just assisting anymore. I was translating fear. Sitting with patients before procedures, explaining recovery without lying, being the proof that life didn't end where pain began. People trusted me. That surprised me less than it should have. Dr. Hale kept a professional distance, but something between us had shifted. Not in a dramatic way, no confessions, no gestures that crossed lines, just an understanding that we saw each other clearly, not as savior or patient, but as two people shaped by responsibility in different ways. One afternoon, a woman about my age refused surgery at the last minute. She said she couldn't live with a stranger's face, that she'd rather keep the scars she recognized. I stayed with her while she cried. Later, Dr. Hale told me the woman changed her mind. She said you helped, he added. I told him I'd only listened. That's rarer than you think, he said. Mark showed up at the clinic 2 weeks later. No warning. I saw him through the glass doors before he saw me. He looked smaller, older, like someone who'd been waiting for a door to reopen and finally realized it wouldn't. He asked if we could talk. I said yes, not because I owed him, but because I no longer needed to protect myself from the conversation. He apologized, not for everything, just for the parts that were easiest to name. He said he felt replaced by the clinic, by my independence, by a version of me he didn't recognize. I told him the truth, that I didn't recognize myself either, and that was the point. We said goodbye without promises. After he left, I expected to feel hollow. Instead, I felt steady. That night, standing alone in my apartment, I touched my face. Not to check it, not to judge it, but to acknowledge it. It was still healing. So was I. And for the first time since the explosion, the future didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I was finally allowed to choose. I thought the hardest part would be learning to live without him. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing how much of my life had been built around being manageable. Easy to love, easy to explain, easy to place. Once I stopped trying to fit, everything around me began to resist. The clinic offered me a longer contract, not temporary this time, a real position with a title and responsibilities. When the director explained it, she spoke carefully, as if afraid I might refuse out of modesty or fear. I didn't. I said yes before she finished the sentence. That decision changed the way people looked at me. Colleagues stopped treating me like a fragile success story and started treating me like a professional. Patients asked for me by name. Doctors included me in conversations I was never meant to overhear, including conversations about funding. One evening, while sorting reports in Dr. Hale's office, I noticed files I wasn't supposed to see, numbers that didn't add up. Grants approved under one name, redirected under another. Experimental procedures quietly billed as standard care. I didn't say anything at first. I told myself it wasn't my business. But the next week, a patient I had grown close to was suddenly discharged early. Too early. Her follow-up surgery was canceled without explanation. She cried in my office, asking what she'd done wrong. That night, I didn't sleep. I started paying attention. Patterns appeared once you stopped looking away. Dr. Hale wasn't the problem. He was careful, transparent, almost stubbornly ethical. But the clinic wasn't just his. Investors were involved, administrators, people who never touched a patient but decided which ones were worth the cost, and I realized something sharp and unsettling. My face, my recovery, had been useful to them, a success story, a cover. I brought my concerns to Dr. Hale carefully, expecting denial. Instead, he went quiet. Then he said, "I was hoping you were wrong." He didn't ask how I knew. He asked how far it went. That was the moment the dynamic between us shifted again. Not patient and surgeon, not colleagues, allies. We started documenting everything, quietly, carefully, files, timelines, testimonies, patients who had been promised care and quietly dropped, numbers that told a story no one wanted public. It felt dangerous. It was. Mark tried calling again during that time. I didn't answer. Whatever part of my life he belonged to was already closed. This wasn't about healing anymore. It was about justice. And for the first time since I lost my face, I wasn't reacting to what had been done to me. I was choosing what to do next. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't a mistake. It was a system. Patients were categorized quietly, not by medical need, but by optics. Those with marketable recoveries were supported, showcased, protected. The rest were delayed, redirected, or quietly removed from the program once the publicity value ran out. I had been valuable until I stopped being silent. Dr. Hale warned me more than once that if we continued, there would be consequences. Funding could disappear, careers could end, reputations could be rewritten overnight. I told him I understood. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already lost everything once. That fear had less power over me now. We compiled the evidence over weeks, not dramatically, methodically. I interviewed former patients under the guise of follow-ups. I collected emails that were never meant to be read together. I kept copies in places no one would think to look. One night, someone broke into my apartment. Nothing was taken, but drawers were opened, papers shifted. My laptop moved an inch to the left, a message without words. The next morning, the clinic director called me into her office. She smiled the entire time. She said I was doing meaningful work, but perhaps I was too emotionally involved. She suggested a leave of absence. Generous, paid, immediate. I declined. That afternoon, Dr. Hale was removed from surgery duty. Officially for review. Unofficially for standing too close to me. That was when I stopped hesitating. I contacted a journalist, not a blogger, not social media, someone old school, investigative, ruthless with facts and allergic to sentiment. I told my story first, not as a victim, as a witness. Then I gave her everything. The article didn't drop immediately. These things never do. Lawyers hovered. Threats were made. Silence was bought where it could be. But truth has a way of leaking. When it finally broke, it wasn't explosive. It was precise. Names, numbers, documents, faces. The clinic issued statements. Investors withdrew quietly. The director resigned, for personal reasons. Dr. Hale was reinstated. I lost my job. That was the price. For a few days, the city felt hostile again, like it was daring me to regret what I'd done. I didn't, because when my phone rang one evening, it wasn't an administrator or a lawyer. It was a former patient. She said, "They approved my surgery. They said it was a mistake before. It isn't now." I sat on the floor and cried for the first time in months. Not from pain, from release. I had been burned once by an accident. This time, I chose the fire. And I was still standing. Losing the job should have broken me. Instead, it clarified everything. For weeks after the article went live, my name floated through conversations I wasn't in. Some people called me brave. Others called me reckless. A few called me ungrateful. I let them. Labels had stopped scaring me. What mattered was what changed. The clinic was audited, programs were restructured, funding was redirected under public oversight. Patients who had been quietly dismissed were called back. Files were reopened, procedures approved. The system didn't collapse. It corrected itself. Dr. Hale resigned 3 months later, not in disgrace, but on his own terms. He accepted a position at a public medical center in Seattle, one focused on access, not image. On his last day, he thanked me, not dramatically, just honestly. "You gave people their faces back," he said, "including yourself." I didn't go with him. That surprised everyone, including me. I stayed in the city, took a job with a nonprofit that worked with trauma survivors navigating medical systems. I spoke at conferences, not about my surgery, but about consent, visibility, and the cost of silence. I told my story the way it deserved to be told, without pity, without polish. Mark tried to reach me one last time. He sent a letter. He wrote that he finally understood, that losing me forced him to confront how much he'd needed control to feel safe. He wished me happiness. He hoped I'd forgiven him. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because closure doesn't always require participation. 1 year after the explosion, I stood in front of a mirror in my apartment, a real one this time, not a clinic reflection. My face was fully healed, not flawless, not artificial. Mine. I traced the faint line near my cheekbone where the scar refused to disappear completely. I smiled. It smiled back. That night, I attended a gala fundraiser for burn survivors. I hadn't planned to speak, but when someone recognized me, when whispers turned into attention, I stepped onto the stage without notes. I told them the truth, that the worst damage wasn't what fire did to my face, it was what fear tried to do to my voice, and how easy it is to disappear when people decide your worth for you. I ended with this: they rebuilt my face, I rebuilt my life, and no one gets to decide who I am ever again. The room stood. Applause wasn't thunderous, it was earned. Later, walking home alone through streets that no longer felt hostile, I realized something simple and profound. I hadn't survived to be grateful, I had survived to be free. And that was the most beautiful face I would ever wear.